My name's Sasha Pete, and I'm joined by a fantastic individual. This man has played for the Socceroos, been a broadcaster in our country, and has been a great advocate for human rights. None other than the great Craig Foster. Welcome to this conversation.
Yeah, nice to chat with you. It's always good to talk football.
So tell us, how did you fall in love with our great game?
Well, I started playing when I was 4. I'm 55 now. And so, I kind of, came through the junior national teams and then went into, in the NSL, and then played a bit abroad, both in Asia and Europe. And then I was in broadcasting, still am today, and a whole range of other stuff. So, it's been 51 years in the game, and it's just gone like that. Continue to try and play, although the knees are falling apart now, sadly. But so perhaps this year might be my last playing. But if it is, that's a fairly long knock, and every game's been enjoyable.
So you grew up in Lismore, in New South Wales. Was it competitive in the backyard with your boys?
Yeah, like many country areas in that time, whether it was Wagga Wagga for rugby league and netball and other sports, which became very famous, country areas, regional areas in Australia were big contributors to a whole range of sports. I don't know how much football, actually, because football was very largely metropolitan, because that's where all of the big clubs were. It's where the development systems were. So I haven't kind of seen any data on that. But of course, it was always the most popular sport by numbers, even in all of the regional areas. You would see that rugby league was the most prominent. We had what was called Group 1 Rugby League up in the north coast of New South Wales. And in those days was very strong. I think it's in a bit of decline today, in part because of the growth of football. But the numbers were always there. Everyone played football at school and the like. I started at 4. I did have 2 brothers, it's true, elder and younger, and they both became professional players as well. Our younger brother was almost 6 years younger, so it was really between the two of us. But yes, like many athletes, having a sibling of similar age in the same sport and competing against each other, whether in the pool, on the court or in the backyard, is one of the key fundamentals to people ultimately becoming professional.
What was it about your family, like maybe your dad or other important people in your life?
Yeah, our father, again, is very common, but he was an excellent athlete. He was Australian national champion sprinter, actually, 110 yards and 220 yards. That was high school, so kind of the national school championships. And because he come from a farm, he never really went beyond that. There was never any kind of idea that someone off a farm in Wine, for those of your listeners who might know that area, it's near Jigai, near Dunoon, not too far from Bangalow. It's just in that beautiful hinterland up there. It was in those times dairy farming area. Today it's all little hobby farms, and all the city people have moved up, including a lot of people from Melbourne, moving up to that beautiful area. And so there was no real talk that you would leave. When he was young, he had to milk the cows in the morning and then get himself off to school, and he would run to school, 4 or 5 Ks there and back. He was an excellent cricketer. He was a regional representative cricketer, opening batsman, and he was a champion tennis player. So yeah, he was clearly a very, very talented sports person. He was kind of stuck there. I don't think the idea ever occurred to the family or people regionally in that area that you would go out beyond to do something in sport, because they had other responsibilities in those days. And that's one reason why I think when his children started to come through, his 3 sons started to come through, and excel in the sport, he kind of put everything aside for that and then just supported them to be able to achieve what it is they were trying to do.
So I remember you playing your first time in Melbourne. You always had a great engine. So obviously genetics had a big part, Dad being a runner. So did you have that engine as a junior player?
So yeah, I think coming from the country, you tend to be a multi-sport athlete, and I think still today, but in the 80s, 70s and 80s, everyone played everything effectively. And then you started to specialize in kind of the early teens and so on. So, we used to do cross-country running, of course, and sprinting, so yeah, I went to national championships in most of those things, including basketball and swimming and other things. So, I think that's very common with athletes is, they have a certain athletic talent, they have whatever the makeup is and the mentality, and they can apply it, particularly in the young ages, they do and can apply it across many, many sports. And that's why the fight for talent, is so important in Australia because, and you're a youth coach, as you were saying, so that, whether it's young males or females, when you find a good footballer, they tend to also be very much sought after by all of the other sports. So, yeah, look, I obviously, growing up in that area, you start to excel, and then you're given more responsibility, and then in the early teens, you have to make a decision as to, which sport it is you're going to follow. Coming from that region, all of the athletes there, our experience was very different from those in Metropolitan, for example. People growing up in Melbourne would have had the NSL very prominent started in 77. So, I was born in 69. So by the time, you were coming into kind of 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, where you might be moving into the club system, everyone was looking there at, the clubs that were there, whatever it was, whether it was, Macedonia, Preston, or Heidelberg, or the Great South Melbourne, or a Footscray JUST. I never had heard of those clubs. Until I hit 15, 16, I wouldn't even know what they were. When we grew up in Lismore, we didn't have SBS because Lismore and the country areas, certainly northern New South Wales, I don't know about other country areas in Australia, but we didn't have the SBS signal. So the only, we had obviously the large commercial networks, and then we had ABC. So the only football that I'd seen until that date was Match of the Day, 1 hour a week on ABC of a Monday night. I didn't even know that the NSL existed until I made the junior national team when I was 15. That was the first ever Joey's. And we traipsed off, around the world to qualify, and then we went to China for the championships. And all of a sudden, that's when all these clubs came out of the woodwork saying, do you want to, Frank Arrock, do you want to come and sign at St. George? Do you want to come and sign here? I was saying, like, who are these people? What are these clubs?
That's amazing. How did you get recognised to play for, let's say, the first Joey side? So was there did you make a state team? Was there regional sides or a country side? How was your talent identified?
Yeah, that's a good and an important question for the game to always think about. All our good generations that came through, and obviously in contemporary times, we're in 2024 now. We're struggling in the male game in particular to produce players of the same quality. So we always should be looking at the system that, as it used to be, and as it evolves and changes, you have to be making sure that we don't leave out or move away from things that were working or work better. It was the system of identification from our perspective was very good in those days because you used to play for the region. So we'd have regional titles. And so we would play for what was called Richmond Tweed, but it was like playing for West Sydney or and so you would have several state titles because of the size of New South Wales, but you'd have Northern and Metropolitan, and so you'd just play for your region in the state titles. That's right. You would do that through the schools, what was called the schoolboys, and through the club system, and then you would be selected for the state team, as you rightly said. So our first state team was under 12s, and we went to Tasmania, which was just fantastic because it's a really important age, and to have actual Australian titles. So we went there and played. We played against Victoria. That was my age was a player and friend of mine who everyone will know in Victoria, Paul Trimboli. So Trimmers was there, and Anthony Grabak, and Mark Talajic, and people like this, playing for Victoria, and we were playing for Northern New South Wales as it was. And then the Navan brothers, Gareth Navan went on to be captain of glory for, hundreds of games and so on. He was, those two brothers, he was the captain of Western Australia. And So already at age 12, your future national teams are already there.
Mm.
13s, 14s, and then by the time you hit 15s, the news came through to Football Australia, Soccer Australia, as they were at the time, that they needed to now form a new, younger national team, and so we were selected at the under 15 national titles, and off we chopped.
That's amazing. And so, was there a national representation prior to your AIS, your time at Canberra? Is that how it went first? So you got to have the green and gold even before you can repeat to that finishing spot.
Yeah, that's right. So, we went into, then I had a sponsor at the time, Soccer Australia, called Kodak. So they called them the Kodak Kids. And so it was the first junior national team of that age group selected. And we went in 1985 to China. So we had a few camps over the course of, I think, under 14s and under 15s. National titles, so they started to get what they call the train on squad or whatever, and then they selected after the 15 titles the actual squad itself. So if you go back, that was like from New South Wales with David Barrett. David played a lot of times for Sydney Olympic. Was a legend of the club. George Jalewski, was Preston Macedonia. And Marconi, was an outstanding NSL player, and and of course Trimmers, and some others. So yeah, it was that first generation came through. So we went across and we played in the World Cup, and that was a lot of fun. We had Vic Dalglish was the coach, who has passed away now, sadly. Vic was a Scottish Australian coach who'd coached in the State League in Sydney for a number of years with Avala and others, and all of a sudden, he was appointed to this job, and so it was a good tournament. We did quite well. The Australian team did well. We didn't know what it is we were facing, but we were Australian, so we thought we were going to go there and win it.
Yeah.
And we beat Argentina 1-0. Argentina had Redondo playing. It actually had Maradona's brother, which we thought was pretty cool. His name was Hugo, but of course he never became as well known as his more esteemed a sibling. But I mean, that would have been impossible anyway. And so yeah, look, the Argentina team was fantastic. We beat them. We beat Germany as well. And we performed really, I think, reasonably well. We set a reasonable standard for Australian junior national teams. We made the quarterfinal, and we played Guinea, and we lost to Guinea on penalties actually after playing really well. So it was a good tournament. And then after that, or late in the tournament, the news came through that actually we didn't know it was happening, but the coach came and the officials of the group of the tour to say, look, they had selected a team of the tournament, what they'd called the World 11 or something of the young tournament for the first time. And actually I was selected in that team. But because we went out at the quarterfinal stage, we were leaving. And so, we didn't stay, to go up to the stage with these guys, which would have been fun. So it was a good experience for everyone, and a good start to international football for that generation.
Oh, that's great. Getting to have the green and gold is obviously a special moment, regardless of what age. But you obviously got to represent our national team on many occasions, including captaining our side. So, talk to me about the first time that capped for the national side, and the first time you got to find that national anthem being played. What does that feel like?
Well, it's special for everyone for different reasons. For some people, it means, they're often the second generation, at those times, second generation. And so for, all these other different ethnicities in Australia, it meant that, this was their son, or, also, of course, for daughters. But in our context, this was their son who, in the new country that, where they'd made a new life and had accepted them, was now representing that country. It was very special for them. For me, it was a little bit different. I'm very Anglo background, so our family, has been here since the 1800s, early 1800s. I come from England on the boat. So what that meant was, playing for Australia, for us being from the country, was very special. Not that it was more special, but it just meant something to the whole region, something to the whole community. There weren't many national team representatives across any sports. In those days, we had, I think, a female cricketer and perhaps a couple of others. Actually, Terry Greedy, who was the goalkeeper in the mid-'80s, had lived in Lismore for a very long time. He was a school teacher, actually. So, we'd had that represented before. So, look, it was pretty special. But what had happened to me is my kind of journey, if you like, was a little bit different. When I came back from that World Cup, I was to go to the Institute of Sport, directly. And what happened was the local community said, listen, can you play one more game before you go? And because the whole community was it was only 35,000 people up in Lismore. It was probably 25 in those days, or 20. It's only a small community. And they said, look, come out and play for your club and just play one more game, and we'll have a civic reception. And, the whole community wants to come and say, well done, you just made this world team, And so I said, yeah, no worries, that'd be cool. I was 15, and so what happened is I went to play, and that was senior football. We would play, in the men's by the time we were like 14 or so, in those years. And I copped the tackle that I didn't see coming from some idiot who played rugby league or something, in the country, and and thought he'd have a game of football. And what happened was, broke my cruciate, snapped the cruciate, and yeah, at 15, yeah.
Oh wow! So having done 3 ACLs, I know how traumatic that is.
Yeah.
Maybe at 15, like
It was pretty big. So the thing was, so I kind of, next thing I knew, I was on a stretcher. I felt it, but I still don't have a picture of it happening because it came from behind as the ball came, and he must have just lunged. And clearly trying to hurt, to be, tackling around knee height on something where you're going near the ball. So, and what happened was I kind of got on, so thankfully, being from the country, my parents didn't just say, well, go down to the local base hospital. What they did is they said, oh, we better ring some people in football. And they knew my elder brother actually was at the Institute of Sport already. All 3 brothers went to the AIS, and he was pretty rare. So they were able to call the AIS and say, listen, we've just, he's just got this injury. What should we do? And their doctors and whoever said, listen, get down to this doctor down in North Sydney. So I had to get on an ambulance plane, and I went down. Anyway, I woke up the next day with my knee, my leg in a plaster cast, which stayed on for, I think it was 8 weeks or something like that. It was quite a long time. And that was a kind of a challenge, because what used to happen in the 80s, that was 1985. And what used to happen was with the ACLs then is that they used to...
the reconstruction?
Was the posterior cruciate. So it was a reconstruction, but which they used some of the hamstring from the right leg as well. And so my hamstring was never as strong as the left one, was always a problem. But what happened was they would tie, because it's like this, and the tackle would come and push the knee out the back. What they decided in those days was that they would essentially tie the leg so that it was like that, and the knee couldn't go out the back anymore. So what that meant, you could never straighten your leg again.
Wow.
Yeah. And so the cast, they put the leg in a cast like that, not a straight leg, but very bent. So when you came out after 6 or 8 weeks, the knee was basically locked. And so I had to do 3-4 months physio, going like every second day to the physio. And all the physio was doing was just pressing on the knee. And the idea was, in the next couple of months, the mobility or the straightness that we get from this knee is going to be what you have to live with. So the idea was, we need to straighten it and just push down as much as possible. So this physio was just pushing the knee down for months and months. Yeah, it's crazy. And then and so it always had a bend. So from that day on, it was never straight again. But I have to say, so go back to the first game with Australia, that was 10 years later. It took me 10 years to get back there, and the guys who I'd been playing with in the 16s, fantastic players like Trimmers, who was a fantastic player. and in my view, could have played. I know he only went to Scotland at some point, but he was so loved in Australia, and such a legend, an icon at South Melbourne. He never really went. But today, a player like Paul Trimboli would be worth $100 million. I mean, he was a phenomenal talent. And Trimmers then by I think 19 or 20, was playing under Arrock, with the Socceroos. When I was that age, Arrock was, wanting me to come to St. George, wanting me to be around, once I'd made, performing in that tournament, talking about come down and be around the national team already. So, it took me a long time to get there. So when I wore that shirt, I had that all signed and I gave it to my parents because, it wasn't an easy journey for them either. But I also got an additional shirt and I took it back to the surgeon. His name was Merv Cross. He's passed away now, but he operated on generations of AFL players, rugby league players, and Socceroos here in Sydney, up in North Sydney. He was very famous, probably the best knee surgeon in the country.
That is an amazing showing resilience. I had no idea that you suffered an ACL reconstruction so early in your career. But it was a year or two later, you're now in the AIS system.
Yeah. So I had a scholarship, and then all of a sudden I came back. I was supposed to go, but I couldn't go for quite a period. I had the operation and blah, blah, blah. And then they said, well, come down anyway, and I could use the medical facilities there and come back to fitness. So, and, that was fine. That was a good group down there. Again, Trimmers was there. And, we had Jason Polak, who would play for Australia, was a fantastic player for Sydney Olympic and went to Greece, of course. And could have gone much, much higher. Jason was a magic player.
Very simple player.
Wow. Just moved beautifully. John Kosh. He should have played for Australia 100 times. He was a phenomenal player. He ended up playing a bit up for Brisbane. I think he was from Brisbane, Newcastle and others, but great talent. And David Healy, who was right back for, South Melbourne for a while and stuff like that. Steve Horvath, of course, I played with the Socceroos with him later. And so that was good. But for me, AIS was about just trying to get back to fitness. And then I went from there to, I ended up going abroad to Glasgow Rangers for a trial because they were one of the clubs. There were some German clubs, a Swiss club, and Glasgow Rangers who, during the World Cup, they were there to watch the 16-year-olds. And they said, listen, you come over here. And then, of course, I went and get injured. So they said, listen, we still want you to come over. So they flew me over and I went over and stayed there for a little while, as so many players did in those times. I mean, I didn't know the relative strength of the leagues, coming from Lismore. We didn't have agents or managers in those days. I had very little idea, but what I was told was that it was a very big club, and I knew nothing about Scottish football. Anyway, I went there and that was interesting. I trained, I was coming back to full fitness. They wanted to sign me for 2 years. And I was training with Souness, and his Trevor Francis and all those guys, with the first team and what have you. And that was going well, but like so many young kids in those days, we couldn't get a work permit. Right? And they tried for months over there, and I kept playing just reserve games, as a trialist, actually. And you're supposed to play only a certain number of trial games. And so they kept changing my name as a trialist. So I just kept playing games and games as a trialist. And then what happened is, and then in the end, they said, listen, the advice is you got to go back to Australia and we got to apply again while you're there. So I said, oh, okay, fine, came back. I can't recall now, it's a long time ago, but I think it took a couple of months before both of us said, look, it's not working. So then that's when I went to Sydney Croatia and started playing the NSL.
That's an amazing story. I mean, I remember you first playing in a very youngish Church Cross side, so being Melbourne. So what was it like, Sydney Croatia? They were very passionate fans. What was it like playing first grade there?
Oh, it was fantastic. I mean, I loved it. I loved the club. It was a great culture. And playing in those clubs in the NSL days was, just a joy because I got to see, and live with, cultural groups and ethnicities that, I didn't know really existed until that time. Of course, at the AIS, it was the first time when I was there, because I come out of a very Anglo area in Lismore, and all of a sudden I was in the AIS in the change room, and of course we lived all together. So, we became lifelong friends, but, the kids from all cultural backgrounds, which was fantastic, and the junior national team. But then I went into Croatia where, there was not just Croatian players, but of course all of the food and the club, and out at a Denser Park. And yeah, it was fantastic. I mean, we had a really good team. In the first year there, we lost in the NSL Grand Final, actually, against Marconi. I think Frankie Farina might have scored the winning penalty. But that team, I was 17, so, that was Graham Arnold was there, was key goal scorer, Arnie, and Robbie Slater was on the right. And we had, I think we had 7 or 8.
I think the front three was Slater, Arnold, Manus Lamond.
Yeah, Manus was there, Slater, and we also had a guy named Sean Ingham. And so Sean would often play on the right. He was a kid from Newcastle, very, very quick, good cross of the ball. But yeah, the Bulldog was there, Slater, and we had a veteran Rosic at the back. It was cultured player from Hajduk Split, where he'd been, I think he was captain of the club or the team at 17 only, and he was in his 30s then. We had Al Hunter at the back. Played a couple of times for Australia, but was a good servant in the NSL. And we had Wally Tavor. Wally was fantastic right back.
Many times for Socceroos, Wally.
Flash Jennings. Yeah, so I think there was like 7 Socceroos or something in the team, something like that. And they all that group were playing in the kind of 85 World Cup qualifying series, and then it was 87 by the time I was there, and then the 88 Olympics the following year they were all involved in. So yeah, it was like probably 2/3 of the Socceroos team. So it was good. We had Ante Rumora, who was another midfielder from Croatia, and it was good. It was good. So yeah, I stayed there a couple of seasons, and I wanted to go overseas. I was in a bit of a hurry. And because I think in part because I'd had that kind of, I'd gone abroad, and then, and they'd said, listen, you're at this level and we want you to come to Europe. And so, I kind of thought I should have been there. So in a way it was a blessing and also a curse. That was cool. So, so what I did is, I signed, for that one season, or actually less than a season, I think, at the Georgies, at George Cross, in order to be able to then go abroad. Under that agreement, I was able to go. And they were signing, Ernie Merrick was signing all of the ex-AIS guys. You wanted a lot of young players. So he signed Frogger Murray. I think Damien was there. And then we had David Clarkson. We had Ernie Tapai was there. Yeah, it was good. Ernie Tapai was there. My older brother was there. So it was a young team. And Lawrence...
Your brother was there as well, so we were the same time.
Yeah, Paul was there, and we had Lawrence Kinder, who did fantastic, that season, and then great player, great attacking midfielder, and then he ended up going abroad, I think, to Belgium or something like that. And we kind of never heard from him again, really, with Australian football. But yeah, it was a good group, and lovely experience, beautiful community, great club.
It's interesting. So your brother, if I remember correctly, I was playing the year before at South Melbourne.
Yeah.
So was it his connection coming together? Would it make sense for you to both play in the same team?
Well, I think that he'd gone there, and I was kind of heading abroad anyway. And I think for whatever reason, I wasn't going for a while, and so, I just wanted a new short-term home. And yeah, because he was there, and then a group from the AIS, that young group had moved in there. As I said, Ernie Merrick was the coach. And so he was trying to recruit as many of the people who, many as the guys who'd come out of the AIS, and had that level of training. So, there's a group of guys there I knew, and it sounded like a good idea. So yeah, I went there, and then, and that was fun. That was a lot of fun. Aussie Latif, and it was fantastic.
Player Aussie Latif. So you named 2 local Sunshine Boys. So Lawrence Kidner and Aussie Latif both start managed in and around the western suburbs here in Melbourne. So it was around this time that you start advocating for rights of footballers. Um, if I've done my research correctly, what's really this
Yeah.
issue of equity for your fellow players? I mean, we know that you spent a long time in what was now the PFA and involved in effectively the advocating for footballers' rights. But what was it that you saw in these beautiful small clubs they're just trying to get by? I mean, you look at the likes of a Marconi and a South Melbourne, the glamour sides of the NSL.
Yeah.
And likes of Cash Plus appointing maybe a young, ambitious coach to get talented kids together and do it on the Moneyball side. Wow, that's what the side was. It was a Moneyball side, this cross team. What's your playing to then advocate for others?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the thing is, yeah, I always was very interested in the team and the group and, that everyone was doing well. And so if there were players within the group or the club, that I thought were being mistreated or, in whatever way, or, didn't have the same rights as I did, then I was always prepared and ready to go and help them or to speak up or to do something. It was just the way I was. I don't know if perhaps it's coming out of the country. I think there's probably a little bit of regional Australia in that because there's very strong communities there where, you don't be silent when people are around. They help people. They don't just go for themselves and try and get something. And, I always think, I was speaking to one of the newspapers only a few weeks ago and saying, in a sporting context, that can also hurt you because what I found was within, not only politically, and that so you become the noisy one, and the troublemaker in the dressing room trying to help everyone. That's if you're a unionist, for example, or an organizer, that's just normal in any industry. But when you have the power and you're one of the better players and you become a Socceroo, then you can do that safely. By a detriment, I mean more in terms of your own career, because what I found is as I got older is I was always very focused on doing the role that was a team needed, right? And there's a lot of players that I played with, some great players, amazing, and they were always focused on just doing their own job, and just being the very best they could be, and they wouldn't do the other roles for the team. And I think in many ways that's also very Australian. And so, if I needed to run and fight and work hard and play in a number 6 when I was a number 8, and I could score goals, I would do that. And so therefore, Australian players, I think, particularly the generation who went to England and all, like myself, all end up becoming captains of clubs. For one of the reasons why that is because they were prepared. Our generation was just completely committed to the team and to doing what it is that we needed to do. And so, whereas if you like more selfish players, and there are many very, very good ones, you just wouldn't do that. It's like get someone else there who's prepared to do all the work for the team. I'm going to do X, Y, Z, and I'm going to look great for that, and I'm going to score, so, that's just part of people's personality, and that was mine. And when I went to England, that was a big factor in it. I ended up playing basically at number 6, and just doing, a lot of work for the teams, whereas that's not where I started off. That's not where I started as a young player. It's not necessarily even what I enjoyed the most, but, you do what it is that, is necessary in the team at the time.
So it's interesting. If I remember correctly, my remembrance of you playing, not watching footage, it was about covering the ground and directing traffic. Now you cover a lot of ground in your advocacy, right? And you speak up for fortunate. So it's interesting how, as a young man, you show the personality on the football pitch and how football imitates life.
That's true. And the thing is, You also, you take a great deal from the game. In order to become a professional or a Socceroo, you have to be able to, play in front of crowds that are against you, and you have to be capable of being criticised. You have to be able to deal with the pressure, and you have to be all of those things. Otherwise, you just don't make it to that level. And the same rules apply to social and political and human rights advocacy. You're walking into really contentious areas, as you are when you're representing, all of the NSL players, and you're going into Soccer Australia to sit with, the chair and the CEO, who basically hate the players, in those days, right? And consider the players as just, a factor of, the least important part of the whole industry. And so, you're going in there, you've got to go in with your hard hat on, and you've got to be strong enough to know where it is you stand, where your principles are, and what it is that you are going to stand for. And you can never, or you should never, compromise on that or sell out the players who you're representing, whether it's your teammates or, the entire group or the Socceroos or the whatever, where I ended up later, for your own benefit. And so, that's very similar to my experience as a player, is that, you never forego what the team needs for your own well-being. And there's many players who do that, because if I scored a few more goals each season, the value of my, as a player and we didn't have the EA Sports that was, monitoring your data, right? But you knew. So, you could play in a way that was going to be in your own personal interest. And many players did that I played with. But I was, that's just simply wasn't part of my DNA. And as you've said, that created some difficulties in football, but it has been a great strength in post-football social advocacy, which has helped a lot of people.
Let's go back to in Melbourne, out of that Socceroos team that probably should have won. And about some teammates, Steve Fullback, who is above the local club that I'm involved in now, was part of that team. Many players, Tom Billy as a coach. Talk to me about what you remember about that game, because, MCG, and this build up, the team had quality, severe quality. Almost two players for every position, really. One of the, there's rates in the newspaper who should be playing in each position. Talk to me about what that night, what you remember about that night.
Yeah.
And the feeling of that game.
Yeah. Okay. Probably two things. What I remember about it, and then what I remember about it afterwards are most important. But I'll tell you what I do know is that Iranians are happy about it, because every time I see an Iranian, whether in Australia or somewhere around the world, they watched that game in 1997. Both legs, of course, we played in Tehran, which was, fantastic performance in front of 129,000 people, and young Harry Kuehl scored, and then we came back to play at home. And I remember absolutely flogging them, but, we just didn't take our chances. You're right in saying it was an amazing generation. I mean, that team that played there was, it was a shame that, it wasn't able to play on the World Cup stage. I mean, that would have been France 98, and certainly Paul Ocon deserved to do so, Ned Zelic. Harry would later play, Dukes would later play. They were already in that group. But you also had Arnie, and you had Frankie Farina, who were just on retirement age. You had a young Muskie, you had the two Vidmars, you had Stan Lazaridis, and of course, Bulldog Slater was there. And then as you say, you had, groups like Damien Murray was the all-time top goal scorer in the NSL, in the squad. Ernie Tapai was still around then, was fantastic, a tricky player and winger. Trimmers was there on the bench, and so it was as you say, there was a huge amount of depth then. And of course, as you say, you had Milan Ivanovic, who'd, been in the European Cup final with Red Star, and Alex. And of course, the three of us were playing together for Adelaide City at that time. So I loved that period because we were playing with great, great players. I played 29 times there, and every game was a joy, And then we had Bimby Corica, and, we had Popper and Craig Moore at the back, and, it was just fantastic. So, that group was very, very strong. Unfortunately, we missed a bunch of chances, which can happen. But then some idiot ran on to the ground in, a kind of historically resonant and stupid moment, and stopped the game, in the second half, as you know. And it was incredible kind of sporting piece of history. But for us, what it did was it stopped the momentum of the game. And at that point, we could feel on the field, and we knew that they had no answer. They had no answer to what we're doing. And that was Terry Venables. And so it was a really important time of renewal in Australian football, because the team learned how to play in a way essentially was imported from Barcelona. That's where he learned it. And so we learned that. And so the movement of that team and the system of play was the first time that an Australian national team had that system of play, or that even type of system of play. Up to then, it was very just regimented, organised, and reliant on its pieces, right? All the coaches that I'd had there previously with Socceroos and all of our national coaches. So what he did is he brought in this system of play of constant movement, playing in movement, rotation of players, which it was in 1997, which Australia didn't really come to even understand for another decade. And we were saying at the time, the senior players were saying, listen, this is unbelievable. None of us have been coached in this way. And we were saying to Soccer Australia, you need to get a whole heap of young coaches under this guy. Like, we need to bring this. Unfortunately, they didn't, until coaching changed some years later. But one of the reasons why it was important is because it was our generation who played under Terry and played in Europe that then came back here and started calling for change in coaching and change of methodology. Is because we were the generation who'd played both in the NSL under numerous coaches and in Europe and under Terry, and we could see the difference. And so, people today who are fans of the kind of modern game, if you like, and who didn't live through those, through those times, wouldn't know the difference. For us, the difference was stark. And so what we did is essentially came back, and some of us went in the media, some of us went in other areas of the game, and that generation was the one that said to Soccer Australia, you need to change. Okay, we had fought against them for our own rights. The PFA was growing at that time, and we wanted professionalisation of the game. So we were saying this administration is not good enough. And it was that generation that developed the A-League model for the first time, and we invested 350 grand of our own players' money, right, from the PFA. It was that was the first time anyone had said that we should have a professional game in Australia. It was called the APL. That came from us. That was the players. And that was the first generation that said, this administration is not good enough. And it was the first generation that said, we've got fantastic coaching talent, but the level and the education is nowhere near what we've just experienced. We've just been there, and we've also been here, and we need to improve, guys. And all of that caused, of course, a load of consternation, but that was necessary. And so that's why today, for me, it's so great to see that, the administration, we're now exporting administrators, actually, and for those who lived through the NSL years, you guys all remember, I mean, every year we had different clubs, and, every year 2-3 clubs fell over, and then, they'd bring someone else back in, and, it was messy. We still have our problems today, but, we've got administrators now who are going abroad, and working at FIFA, and working at AFC and the like. So we've got a chain of, we now develop football administrators, we now develop football coaches. Of course, we've got a whole new generation of Australian coaches, not female, but a large pool of male. And we've got finally young kids coming through. So in the late 90s, we saw 2024 as where we want to be on the pathway. And it was our generation who were there, and we came back and said, okay, we need to get there. That's why that game and that team and that coach were very, very important. It actually changed Australian football in a lot of ways.
Interesting. By this time, they'd already gone overseas. You spent some time in Asia So you experience what it was like to be a part-time player versus a full-time player. It's something. There's something nostalgic about my reminiscence, because it's my childhood that I sat on a fence at a Cash Cross or a South Melbourne. But obviously, you feel the difference of playing in professional clubs, being a full-time professional, and then having to be a part-timer in quality sides, mind you, right? So,
Yeah. People forget that when we were at Sydney, Croatia, Arnie was a carpenter, right? And, you can agree with his coaching and his philosophy of football or otherwise, and this is an important part of the game. We don't all agree, that's the point. But when you consider that generation come from being carpenters, and we trained 3 days a week at NSL at Sydney, Croatia, and played on the fourth, so it was 4 day a week effectively, and we used to get paid in cash, brown paper bags, because they had to get it over the till, they had to get it from the club, every second week at the home game is where they would get their funds, right? Those community clubs. And so then, you'd see them be divvying it out. Okay, here's your wage this week. Here's your wage this week. That we all lived through that, and they were fantastic players. They're very different. The NSL has to be captured, in the essence of what it was. I think in some documentaries we talk about its importance, but the personalities and the quality of people and the quality of players that were there. I'll tell you what, I mean, Adelaide City, we played Melbourne Knights, in the grand final. I mean, Branko Milosevic, Danny Tiato, Horvey was there, Dukes up front, Stabber Marth, Spiteri. You're talking about, there was a huge amount of players who had the capability to go abroad. Some of them do brilliantly, but all of them go to Europe. Like almost the entire NSL could have just gone, listen, in those days, listen, you guys just pack up and go and play in a club in Europe somewhere, in one of the top, probably six. And by that, I'm saying Switzerland and others in those professional leagues. It was amazing. Great times.
So tell me, it's your time after Venables is coaching at the Socceroos that you make your way to Portsmouth. Is the connection the reason why you made that move?
Yeah, so so basically Venables had the Socceroos, and and I was performing well under him because I understood his system. Okay, and so I could play in a number of positions, and when I was playing, I was able to help the other players around me as to how to understand when and how to move. So, I already had that understanding as a player, which obviously has benefited me in my media work, and I've done quite a lot of youth coaching. So, the understanding the game, what, why, and when, essentially, what are we doing? Why is it important? And when are you supposed to move? Or like, what's your role? That I understood extremely well. And so, and that was great. And so then what happened is Venables, he got involved in a club at Portsmouth. And so he said to, a few of the Socceroos, Robbie Ennis, who was a very, very talented central midfielder. I mean, his passing quality was just fantastic. Technically, he was almost like a young Ocon, actually, with the excellence of his technique. And John Aloisi, the great JA, and he wanted to sign us. And the dream was, what we were sold is that, I'm going there, I'm going to bring some of the Tottenham players that was in the championship, and then we're going to take them back up, as everyone does today, as a Burnley has done or a Brentford have done, and da-da-da. And that's what we were sold. And unfortunately, when we got there, that didn't materialise. It's great to see so many some young Australian players going, Yangi and others going and playing there today. It's always been a home for Australian players. But unfortunately, in our time, what Venables had promised, that was the enigma of the man, rest his soul, was that he was an incredible football coach. Everyone loved him,
Without.
He was a great personality. He was gregarious, and he knew the game, and he could talk with every specific player about exactly what they needed to do. So his level of knowledge impressed everyone. That's the Socceroos were all going, well, Craig, you need to do this, and Alex, you just need to do this, and Aurelio, what I've seen is this, and you may be right. And But when it came to, his dealings off the field, then, he let himself down, unfortunately, and he let many others down, including the club of Portsmouth, and including us, because, what we walked into, wasn't what, we'd been promised. So anyway, that was fine. But, I always played well under him because I understood his football.
So if you had to think back at any game that you've ever played and that game again, but there's a game jump back into your mind.
I'll tell you an important game, and it became an important game probably in the context of Australian football, because later I would join SBS, which was the most influential, broadcaster and cultural force in Australian football. And by that, it means, SBS were focused on teaching Australian, supporting Australian fandom, lifting up the ethnicity of clubs and the love that everyone had, and also promoting a certain type of the game, a certain vision of the game, not just to the community, but to broader Australia, actually. So the game that was really, I think, kind of transformative in a way was, after that Iran mess, where we really should have got through, that team over the course, I think with Venables, competitive games, I think we probably were undefeated, and it was 3-3 against Iran. And then we went to the Confederations Cup, which was in Saudi Arabia, and we made the final, right? And so we were the first team, I can't remember the stat, but like for 3 years or something that Brazil hadn't scored a goal against. We had 0-0 in the group stage. We beat Mexico, we beat Uruguay in the semi, and then we came back up against Brazil. But the first game, 0-0 against Brazil, we had Bozza in goals, and we were playing fantastically well. But that was in November 97, and that was like 6 months before that Brazil team made the final of France 98.
Yeah.
And without Ronaldo, got beaten by Zidane's team, a fantastic team. But with Ronaldo operating, was probably one of the great Brazil teams in history, right? That was, so we played against a Brazil team that was, on the left was Robbie Carlos, and Denilson, who had been the most expensive player in the world, was bought by Real Betis, who people don't even know that club today. But we had on the right was, Cafu, you had Juninho Paulista, you had the three R's, Ronaldo, Fenomeno, Rivaldo, who I think was at Barca at the time, and Romario. Okay, one of the all-time great strikers and crazy dudes, and who obviously played in for a short time for Adelaide. You had, of course, Dunga was the, just the central, and at the back you had Junior in the center, and so you had, that was an unbelievable football team. And I played on the right, I think in the first game, and we might have had Muskie there somewhere. And I remember, I think Muskie might have been right fullback, and I was right inside midfielder or something. And probably we had Robbie Sard. I don't know. I don't go back and look at the games, but and I'll never forget a moment in the game where Denilson came to Muskie, and he did, and he was famous because he would do about 6 step overs. Denilson was famous at that time for that. He would go 1, 2, and sometimes he just for fun, he would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and go, right? And so defenders are just, you're just going crazy. And he was a left-footed player, was a beautiful player. And he went at Muskie and he did this, right? And went around him. Anyway, they had a cross and it went out for a corner. And I came back to defend the corner, and I said, Muskie, you all right? You all right, buddy, or what? You going to recover from that? And he said, and he was upset, he was pissed off. He was going, F you, he was saying, rack up. I was laughing. Anyway, we playing the game. And then, of course, I had to go to the right. I was playing in the midfield. I had to go over to defend him at some point, and then I had to defend him, and he's done the same thing to me. And all I could hear was Muskie saying, "Oh yeah, Foz, how you going? You're gonna survive after that, buddy?" What? And the guys on the bench are laughing, and I looked over and I saw Trimmers, and this was 10, 11 years later after we started as kids, but I knew him very well. And I'll never forget after that game. So we had, Ronaldo, we had a 0-0 in the final, as people remember. Dukes got himself sent off very, very early in the game. And so we ended up playing with 10 men against that team, right? And we actually got done 6-0, right? And Ronaldo scored a hat trick, right? One of the all-time greatest players that's ever played the game, right? And I experienced that twice.
The best finisher of all time. So sitting mostly comes at centre forward as the best centre forward. In first place, sometimes you pick, right? It's like
many people, I mean, the coaches, Barcelona fans, Inter Milan, you remember he had a really bad knee injury, right? And and then he ended up at Real Madrid where he was still phenomenal. He's an unbelievable player, but the capability that he had was like nothing else that, anyone had seen really at the time, because he had that as well. He had the step overs, but at unbelievable speed, right? So, I saw them live, but in the first game in particular, I remember watching Danielson and, live there on the field. Obviously, they had, the majority of possession and, and their little combinations and the technical skills. So every time you'd come close, it's not like playing any other team in the world, right? When you'd get close to them to try and close them down, of course, they had the ability to actually do something, to take you on, try and go past you. That's a very dangerous player. And I'll never forget afterwards, 0-0, and we were walking off the field and the subs came across as well. And Trimmers came up and he said, wow, that was something else. And I looked at him and I said, no, actually what he said is, he said, wow, Foz, they're playing a different game. And I looked at him and I said, you know what? That's exactly right. That's exactly the point. I said, they are playing a different game to us, right? And I had the chance to see it live and experience it. And that was formative because I came back here, post-career and went on air with Johnny and Les and started saying, we need to be better. We need to, we produce this generation to go and play for these clubs, but none of these players, have been in within cooey of winning a Ballon d'Or. We haven't even, I think Harry Kewell might have been our only player who's in the top 50 for a Ballon d'Or. And, I once asked Real Madrid, I spent some time at Madrid and Barca and all that when I was broadcasting. And I once asked them, actually it was Butragueño, who'd been there for many, many decades, but as post his playing career as the football director. And I once asked him, listen, have you ever looked at an Australian player? Like, have you guys ever been close to signing an Australian? And he said to me, the only Australian player that we ever were seriously looking at was Viduka.
okay.
Right. And so, I came back having seen that and then went on air saying, okay, we need to change our development system. We need to produce better kids. We need to be able to compete with this. We need to think about our coaching methodology. I went down to the level 3 coaching methodology and I'd been under Eddie Thompson, Raul Blanco, many of the guys here in Australia, I'd played in the NSL. I knew what they were all doing. All the players knew. And, Manfred Schaefer and, many of them who won. I mean, Zoran Madic, I think he won 2 or 3 championships. I knew how they all worked. And so having seen that and then been under Venables, I had a frame of reference to come back and say, okay, we need to redo everything here.
It's interesting. I mean, football's about levels. And once done layout, there's another level. There's another level. And so which brings on to my next question. If you're speaking now to a 15, 16, 17 and I want to break that level, the level from junior football to their first senior side. That's another level jump. And you can more levels. But what would be one piece of advice that we would give to that young girl looking to break through to that next level?
Yeah, so the thing is, they should ask Ocon and Zelic, and guys who, and Spider, who won a Champions League, and Harry, who won a Champions League, and Timmy, who scored unbelievable left foot volley against Netherlands, they should ask those guys, because I didn't have an opportunity to play in the World Cup. So, I'm always, what my advocacy for football and to football has always been, let's be the best in the world. So let's talk to the best in the world. Let's have the best players. Let's have the best coaches. Let's have the best thinking, firstly. And when I was working at SBS, my mission, the thing that drove me was, let's talk about the game in a way that's going to make us the best in the world. That's how I approached the job. And I said, we talk about the game in a pretty stupid way, actually. It's just very cliched. And our understanding of the game as a culture is not like the Spanish or the French or the German, which I studied. What I said is, when I went with Johnny and Les, I said, look, what we say on air has a big impact because the way we see the game is important. And that's when I started to introduce the tactics on air and started to analyze on air. And all of that was wanting to change the football culture in Australia, because the smarter we are, the better we are going to become, right? And we needed to move away from what was a very Anglo-phile culture of football at the time and way of seeing the game. Our way of seeing the game was, even though we had fantastic players, it was just, we're going to fight like hell, and we're going to be the underdogs all the time. And that's what we still hear that sometimes today, even with national teams.
That's what remains. I think maybe that's been our default position again. So
we actually gone back to that. So I wrote a book in 2010, and one of the chapters was overdog, not underdog, right? So the idea is, just because you're small doesn't mean that you always have to be inferior. And we're one of the greatest sporting nations on earth, but not in football. And there are reasons for that. And it's not just our size. We can compete in anything. And by size, I mean population. And even the number of kids who play the game is very much larger than many countries who have much more experience than us. Uruguay is a great example, right? And so therefore, there are reasons why we're not excelling at the very highest level of world football. We want to be there. What drove us at SBS is we want Australia to be there, because when the game succeeds in Australia, we feel as though Australia is going to understand multiculturalism and really buy into it much more. So it wasn't in fact about football. It was about Australia's future through football, right? But to get there, we have to ask, how is it that we get there? And one of the ways that we need to contribute to that is our on-air conversations. Because what happened is, I would go to World Cup. So like in 2006, for example, and Jurgen Klopp was doing the analysis for the local German broadcaster, which was right next door to us with SBS near the Berlin Gate. And I would walk past their studio every day, and it was just basically open to the public. And this young coach, Klopp, I think he was at Mainz at the time. He might have been Hoffenheim, something like that. Right? He was well predating his Dortmund days. He was the guy who was doing the on-air analysis. And in fact, I think it was during that World Cup was when Ralf Rangnick was brought on, and he might have been at Hoffenheim, and he was brought on to explain about the play of Germany. And he so impressed people that they started to lift him up and say, hang on, this coach knows, along with Klopp. And so what I saw accorded, with them and the Italians and the Spanish, the people who've won, what I saw accorded with my views that we need to talk about the game in a different way. And it can't always be when teams lose that it's just no effort. They haven't tried hard enough, or the mentality is not strong enough, or it's just not good management. There has to be a tactical side as to where things are going wrong. And so all of that. So, all of those strands come together, as you said before, as a player, what you experience, experiencing the World Cup at 15 showed me what the Argentinians could do. Right, I saw it live. I'd come out of Lismore and I went, "Oh my God, have a look at this guy Redondo!" Right, and and then I was selected in this representative team with him, but I'd seen the way they could play, and I saw their training, and I saw them, and I thought, "Oh my God, what's going on?" And then through the Brazil playing them, then Venables playing under him, seeing that tactical. I later asked him, because I got on with him very well, and I later asked him. I said, "Tell, look, mate, what you've done with us, what you did with Australia with the system of play, none of us had seen before." And I said, with the greatest respect, you didn't learn that in England, right? Because you guys don't coach like that. And I was in England. I said, I've seen that. I've seen, and where did you learn it? And he said to me, "Oh, I learned it at Barcelona." He said, "I was a young coach. Bobby Robson was there at Barca, and Robson was leaving, and he recommended me." So he said, "Mate, I don't know, he's in early 30s or something, mid 30s." And he said, And he said, you'd have to check his age, but he said to me, I was young and I was inexperienced, and he wanted me to have Barcelona because he felt I could manage the situation. He's a big personality, and he said, so I went in there, and I had very limited skills, but I had an understanding of the game. I learned quickly. So he said, what I did is I said to the assistant coaches, and he brought Archibald, I think, up front, the Tottenham striker, and I mean he had Lineker. I mean he had a fantastic team. And what he said is, I went in and I told the assistants, you guys take training while I just monitor the squad and oversee and find my way as to what's needed here. And he said, I just told them to take all the training sessions, and then I would just talk to them about it all day. And he said, it took me a couple of months. I absorbed it all. I knew the system perfectly, and I developed the skills, right? And so, and so I knew where that system had come from, and I knew where the thinking had come from. And then, that's how we develop, that's how we evolve. And so today, after 20 something years on air, I keep an eye on the cultures, how they're developing, where it is that we are and where I think the gaps are, to one day, hopefully in our lifetimes, make us the best football country in the world.
Absolutely brilliant. I've never had that answer that way. And quite, it just goes to show the DNA of the person you are and the advocacy you've done in our game. You're doing and continue to be a special voice for Australian football. May it continue. And thank you very much for your contribution to Australian football.
No problem. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and it's been a great life in the game.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay. So thank you very much. I'll keep it together. I appreciate your time, and I hope we're something to enjoy the conversation.
All right. Thanks, buddy. Good to chat. Okay. See you, mate.